welcome to On the Ledge podcast. I'm your host, Jane Perrone, and in this episode, seeds take centre stage. Plus, I answer a question about biochar. So, whether you are a dedicated follower and practitioner of my On the Ledge Sow Along, or a complete newbie to growing from seed, I hope this episode will inspire you about the wonders of seeds. In this episode, I am talking seeds with Jennifer Jewell, host of wonderful podcast Cultivating Place. Jennifer is an expert on this subject. She's written a whole book called We Sow on the personal, ecological and cultural significance of seeds. So this isn't a practical On the Ledge Sow Along episode, but think of it as a way of resetting your mindset about seeds, their importance, their centrality in our lives, and maybe this will inspire you to think again about whether you want to get involved with sowing any kinds of seeds, let alone houseplant seeds. If you've no idea what the On the Ledge Sow Along is, this is my annual mission to get listeners sowing houseplant seeds. I've been doing it every year on the podcast since, I think, 2018. And in the show notes, you can go and find all of those previous episodes listed and catch up on all the content covering everything from sowing cacti and succulents to growing ferns from spores to the structure of a seed and more. This interview will really make you think about where your seed's coming from and who's controlling the system.
I'm Jennifer Jewell, and I am best known as the creator and host of Cultivating Place, Conversations on Natural History and the Human Impulse to Garden, a nationally syndicated public radio program and podcast out of the United States. I am also the author of several books about gardening and specifically how gardens and gardeners are powerful intersectional agents and spaces for change, helping to grow our world better. So I do not talk about how to garden. I talk about why we garden and why that is important in our world generally, even if you don't garden, Jane.
This is totally chiming in with a strand of my podcast On the Ledge, which is seed sowing and sowing houseplants from seed. This is something I'm really passionate about, and it's part of a wider passion for seeds generally. And I loved in your introduction where you described the four primary elements of water, air, soil, and fire, and then added on seed as the fifth element that humans need to make life on Earth. Seed is life. I love that idea. And I was going to ask you, well, why did you write that book? But I guess that explains it pretty well. Was this a sort of a pandemic exploit? Why the timing might suggest so.
It became a pandemic exploit, but what was interesting to me in beginning to write it in 2020 was how long I had been circling this topic. So my third book, We Sow, on the personal, ecological, and cultural significance of seeds, which is this reader of a book, not a picture book you're going to put on your coffee table, exploring the state of seeds in our world. What I realized was that in the podcast, going back to its inception in 2016, in the current iteration, and in my first two books, I had been steadily accumulating quite a few interviews and conversations and research threads into what we mean when we say the state of seeds in our world. I had been talking to people about the restoration economy's seed supply and how generally in these times of biodiversity loss and habitat fragmentation and degradation, and the subsequent urge to restore wild lands, whether it's in the UK or in the United States, in order to offset these losses, there has been this enormous industry created of people growing site-appropriate, ethically sourced, and genetically diverse native seeds in order to seed those restoration projects. And this has been going on for several decades, since the UN first declared this restoration need in the Nagoya Protocol back in the 90s. But so that's one level of seed, right? But then there's, of course, like the food and commodity seed supply. And then there's the home gardener seed supply and flowers and food and herbs in all of that. So when we say the seed industry, it's really this mammoth, multifaceted economic and philosophical entity in our world. It's been a long time since I started looking into it, but in this focus that started in 2020 and took me through the beginning of 2023 when I turned the book in, it's kind of a labyrinth of how do you find who is growing seed for what reason, with what agenda, and why should we as gardeners care about that, and how do we act on that for the best for all of us, really.
I thought about you this week when I was sowing some seed that is so precious to me. So this was seed that I collected of the plant sea beet by the sea in Dorset quite a few years ago. It's on my desk somewhere. I'm looking around for it. I think it was probably about at least 7 years ago I collected this seed. And I had this sea beet in my garden for all that time, but we had a very harsh winter or harsh spell during last winter, and I lost it. And I was really upset. And then I was going through my seed stash the other day because, right, we all have seed stashes, right? And I found
we do.
I still had some seed of this sea beet that I'd saved. And I was so excited, and I sowed it, and I thought, gosh, nothing may happen. But indeed, it has started germinating, and the excitement is palpable. And I'm sure people who don't share our passion for seeds would find this completely inexplicable. But for me, it's a link to that experience, that holiday. It's a crop that I love to harvest. That is a perennial vegetable that's so useful. It's got everything going for it. And I really thought of that seed is life comment in your introduction when I saw these seeds coming up. It's so valuable, isn't it? Are there any particular seeds in your seed stash that are particularly special to you, or seeds that you have that have a special place in your heart?
Definitely. We do a lot of camping and hiking across the U.S. West, my partner John and I. And when the opportunity presents itself and it makes sense for us to collect seed from some of the native plants we love, especially the ephemeral annuals or wildflowers. I should make a note here. It is illegal to collect on public land. You have to collect on private land with permission. And there are ethics to how you collect native plant seed, including never taking very many seed. So, and then growing those in your garden and collecting those seeds again. So I'm thinking here of one of our fabulous native salvias in California called Salvia carduacea, and it's also known as thistle sage. And it is just like the most unlikely of annual plants. And it has a gorgeous thistle-like seed head, but that is in the verticillasters that you think of as when you think of native California sages and salvias. And the show of it in the spring with this very white silver foliage that's kind of furry, and then these thistle heads that go up sort of pagoda-like the stem. It's just magnificent. And to have it come from this teeny, teeny little seed and then see it germinate just like you experience. Like, it just slays me every time, Jane. I mean, it is a miracle taking place, like, between your hand and the soil. Yeah, it is engaging with the very essence of life. And it reminds you a little bit of your place, I think. For me, it does.
It is powerful stuff. But the reality is that you and I are in a minority here, aren't we? And I think you use the phrase in your book, seed stupid, in that we really, as human beings, there's a vast majority of us who, for many different reasons, really don't appreciate some of the things that we've just been talking about. How have we come to this pass that seeds are so misunderstood or not even thought about?
Right. I want to clarify that when I used that term seed stupid, I was definitely applying it to myself as well. Like, it was a surprise to me, Jane, in 2020, when I thought to myself, why is our seed supply so impacted by even the earliest days of this pandemic? Like, how is the seed supply in our world so fragile that it is backed up already? And I thought to myself, there is a lot about the seed supply world that I don't understand. And as a gardener who really prides myself on being, in the know and well-informed and very intentional, all those earnest words we might use to describe ourselves, like, I just didn't know what I should know. And I realized that if so many of our world has developed to live and thrive at a distance from our plant communities. So, like, people often use the word divorced, like we are divorced from nature, and we think we can get along without it because the grocery stores supply our food, the subway supplies our drive. You go back and forth and life goes on, whether or not you understand plants. But when you really start to think about all the things in your life, from, cotton clothing to the food on your plate, whatever it might be, everything comes back to almost everything that you care about in the world in terms of food, housing, clothing. Like, these all come back to seed at some level. The only thing that doesn't would be like rock and metal. The derivatives of those don't need seed, but everything else really does. And so for us, for many people, we describe like the lack of ability to identify different plants in the landscape as just a green blur. Like, people are described as looking at the world as a green blur, because of course, everywhere you go, there are plants, even in the desert, even at the highest alpine reaches, and certainly even in cities, there are plants everywhere. But if you don't see them as individuals, you see them as this green blur. And this is plant blindness is something that we've talked a lot about in our world over the past 25 years even. But this inability to understand the role of seed, it occurred to me like that is not just seed blind, it's seed stupid, because it is a blindness that really hobbles your ability to engage with the world in the best possible, fullest possible way, and therefore treat the world and show up in the world as your best self somehow. And this is one of the things I was trying to highlight. Even if you don't want to be a gardener, the importance of seeds and therefore their plants in our world is something we should not allow to be taken away from us under the guise of the words convenience or, I don't know, cleanness or efficiency. Like, it is irresponsible, I think, for us. And also not preferred. Like, there is some pleasure that you lose if you don't have these relationships. And once you have them, there is this immense pleasure that is gained from understanding and engaging with plants and seeds at a more knowledgeable level, a more intimate level.
And we also need to know this stuff because seeds are big business, right? This is the other thing that comes out in your book. Can you tell us a little bit about the business of seeds and what you discovered in researching your book?
Well, I think that most people that engage with plants in some way, which are most likely the people listening today, have this understanding that at the largest industrial scales, the plant and therefore the seed industries have continued to become consolidated. And I want to connect here how seeds and plants and knowledge of them have been distanced from most people's everyday lives, and this consolidation as not just being an accident or an inadvertent consequence, but it has actually been strategized and planned and executed with full intention to make most people unaware of the associations of seeds and plants to their economic and their environmental and their social lives, so that the people who are controlling them can do what they want with them and continue to garner control and profit over the best interests of people and the planet. These things have happened intentionally and strategically. And it's when you start to look at these connections, it's horrifying, Jane, how much agency we have abdicated to these large corporations, international corporations, who really don't give a hoot about the integrity or the genetics or the fact that seeds and plants are part of our inherited common birthright. And they are being purchased and patented and secreted away at this crazy rate. So at this point, something like 60% of all the seed industry's value is held by, owned by, controlled by, profited by 4 major pharmaceutical petrochemical companies. Now, whenever I deliver that line, I ask people to really sit with what that means to them. That means that your food, your flowers, your medicine, your forests, your watersheds, they are all being impacted by pharmaceutical, petrochemical, corporate decision making. Now, chances are, the more you think about that, the more yucky that is to you. That your ability to survive on this planet, retail shopping notwithstanding, is controlled by these people who have a very different value system than most of us have for what goes into our air, what goes into our water, what goes into our children's food, and what our future looks like as a result. And to become aware of it means that maybe you do a little more research, and maybe you read some of the fine print, and maybe you make different purchases, or maybe you make a different check mark on your voting ballot for what the bonds are, or if you want your representatives to support the farm bill this year. We all have more agency than we think to say this is not how we want our plants and seeds stewarded in this world.
It's scary stuff, isn't it? But this is why I love buying seed or buying seed from little companies. Like you mentioned in your book, a few different companies in the UK that I've bought seed from, the Real Seed Company and Brown Envelope Seeds amongst them, who are doing things really differently, who are, not only advocating for, but also selling open pollinated vegetable seeds and also, seed swaps and saving seed, all these incredible skills that we have kind of started to lose, but actually we haven't lost because there are lots of people who are preserving and fighting back. Can you tell me about a couple of examples of how the fight back's happening and the characters involved?
Oh, there are so, I mean, if the research for this book was really depressing in terms of how much genetic diversity has been lost or patented or genetically modified or covered in chemicals. I mean, there were two different statistics that were, again, just gut wrenching for me. One of them being that across the US, all non-organic corn being planted, and there are hundreds of millions of acres across the United States that are planted out in corn for food for livestock, for biofuel, for canola oil, for, all these different large commodity purposes. All non-organic corn planted in the U.S. on these hundreds of millions of acres, if it's not organic, it is covered with chemicals that are toxic to most insects. And they are predisposed with this Roundup Ready genetic modification to emit this neonicotinoid impact. And it's held, that pesticide cocktail is held in every cell of this corn. And because it's wind pollinated, it means that it crosses and spreads that contamination to all the corn within miles and miles of it. So that was terrifying, right? And then the other one about commodification and then the third one that I want to share before I get to the good news, Jane, is that the Xerces Society, which is in the U.S. the largest nonprofit, non-governmental nonprofit, working for the protection of invertebrate life on our continent, but certainly in our world at large. So these are all the insects, all the pollinating insects, all the mussels and clams and beetles and bugs that make our world go. This group, the Xerces Society, has been focusing quite a bit on monarch butterfly research and data collection. And the primary larval, I think the only larval food for the monarch butterflies in their life cycle is one of the milkweed plants. Now, there are many species of milkweeds, and they are, different native regions to these. But the Xerces Society across the U.S. is having a very hard time finding milkweed plants in a commercial nursery that are not contaminated with this neonicotinoid genetic contamination. And that means that you are essentially welcoming a butterfly to your garden with a meal, and then you're then poisoning them with that meal, which is heartbreaking. It is not what we want to do. It is not what we intend to do. So we're against some big, big problems. On the good news front, which is what you were asking me about, opposing all of this are hundreds and hundreds of people like you, like me, like the Xerces Society, like home gardeners and native plant societies and, organic gardeners across both of our countries and continents who are working to stand against all of this, who are saving seed and sharing seed and supporting seed growers who keep this integrity in mind. They are supporting seed libraries in our public libraries or at our botanic gardens that are non-GMO and organic seed, open pollinated, non-patented. That's one of the important things, is that we keep as much of this genetic in the hands of the gardeners to share and grow out and share again in perpetuity. That's how humans have continued to share and adapt and select the plants we love the most. Like when you think about where I am, some of the really interesting people, and there are so many that I interview for the book, but Rowan White is a woman of indigenous descent, based now in California. She was born and raised in what is now upstate New York in the Akwesasne tribal area. And she is the founder of the Indigenous Seed Keepers Network, helping to kind of inoculate tribal communities across the United States with information about their heritage plants, about their seeds, about how to save them, about how to share them, about how to store them so that they continue to grow on well. That is one person who is making an enormous impact. You go over to the East Coast and you think of Kay Green and his partner, Doug Mueller, who started the Hudson Valley Seed Company. Kay Green was the founder of the very first public library-based seed library in the U.S. That's another one. There are so many, I can't even talk about them all. But in total, their efforts and their passion on the ground in this grassroots seed-based level really gave me a great hope. One of the seed keepers that I interview, a man named Jeff Quattrone, who helped to develop a whole network of seed libraries in New Jersey, and who has worked to find and re-propagate and grow out and share forward the seeds of these, I think, between 5 and 7 now, heritage varieties of tomatoes that were bred in New Jersey historically. He said to me, the larger the mainstream, Jennifer, meaning those commodity, pharmaceutical corporations and those chemical companies and all of that, the larger that mainstream, the larger the space for the undercurrent. And our undercurrent of seed keepers who are working to preserve the integrity and the great biodiversity of seed available to us at all of these levels is very vibrant, and it is alive and well. And I have an incredible amount of faith in its power to overcome.
More from Jennifer shortly, but now it's time for our Q&A, and this concerns biochar. Jim got in touch to ask about using biochar in houseplant substrates. Biochar is something I'm still experimenting with on my houseplants, so I can't give you a totally comprehensive answer, but here's what I know so far. Let's start with the obvious question. What on earth is biochar? It's basically a form of carbon. So if you take wood and you heat it under extremely high temperatures, biochar is what results. You can make biochar out of other organic materials, but usually it's wood that we are talking about as the base material for this product. And if you've ever heard of the term terra preta, well, this is biochar. In the Amazon, indigenous peoples were improving their soils using biochar over many, many centuries, and we're still using biochar today. Why does it work though? Well, if you imagine that biochar is, how can I describe it? It's like a massive and very intricate sponge inside. There's lots of teeny tiny holes inside every tiny piece of biochar. So that enables biochar to hold on to a lot of things that we need for our substrates. That includes nutrients, of course, but it can also include air and water and even microorganisms too that can help your soil to thrive. There is a really good RHS page on biochar, which I will link to in the show notes, which goes through lots of technical information and also practical information about when to use biochar and when not to use it. In the last 10-20 years, lots of firms have latched onto this idea of biochar as something that's good for your soil, and there are a number of companies offering these products. Certainly in the UK, I think one of the best known ones is called Carbon Gold. But what can they do for houseplants? Well, I think they can be a really valuable addition to houseplant substrates. They don't contain nutrients in and of themselves, but they can be a place for nutrients to be stored for the use by your plants. Similarly, air and water, as I've already said. If you want to use biochar, you can just simply add it to your substrate when you're repotting, or you could just sprinkle it on the surface of your pot. Every biochar product will be slightly different in terms of what they're recommending you put in. Usually when you're talking about application rates, I've seen anything from 2% to 20% by volume listed as the recommendation. So look at your own product and see what it recommends. Carbon Gold's Biochar Houseplant Booster, they recommend putting 1 to 2 teaspoons in an average pot and mixing that in and watering as normal. The one thing they point out is that, as I say, biochar holds onto a lot of water, so you won't need to water so frequently. It's going to hold water very, very effectively. So it's going to be something you're going to have to experiment with. You may also hear about charging or activating biochar. Again, if you're buying a product that's like the houseplant booster that's specifically designed for houseplants, you can assume that you don't have to do this, but there is there's tons of information out there about charging biochar. Basically, biochar is just like a sponge. It doesn't contain nutrients. Nutrients have to be added to it. Water has to be added to it. So you can do that in different ways. Most people will be adding it to water with a nutrient solution in it to make it charge up with all those resources that your plant's roots are going to need. What I would say is just make sure that when you're buying a biochar product, ask questions of the supplier, like how would I use this with houseplants? Do I need to charge it ahead of using it? And find out the information you need in order to use it effectively. Can you make biochar yourself? Not recommended. It's a very specific process involving particular equipment that you probably aren't going to have in your home or garden. So yeah, I would say no, don't try and make biochar at home, and don't try to use bits of charcoal from a fire if you have one, because again, that is not going to work because the materials won't be charred to the right level, and you could have harmful substances in there too. So you really are better off buying the stuff. I hope that helps, Jim. And if anyone else has got experience with using biochar, then do get in touch and I will update with your thoughts and experiences on this topic. It's a really fascinating one, and I think we'll be hearing a lot more about biochar in the future. Thanks for your question, Jim, and if you've got a question, drop me a line on theledgepodcast@gmail.com. And now it's time to get back to my chat with Jennifer. I was just thinking, while I was reading this book, about the context of growing houseplants from seed, and I was blithely thinking, oh, well, of course, the world of houseplants, this isn't such an issue because actually there are not that many people who grow houseplants from seed, and those who do tend to be the kind of specialist folks who are into gesneriads or who are into, pollinating their anthuriums and so on. But then I remembered very, very abruptly that actually in my own book, there was a story about the Kentia palm, Howea forsteriana, and how Lord Howe Island was basically, that was their main income, was the seed, and how that was absolutely devastated by invasive rats basically eating all the seed. And of course, in the houseplant world, of course, it's the same applies. I guess we've slightly escaped from the same issues as vegetables because it is quite a niche, really neat, quite a niche hobby. But it's interesting to see how even in this hobby, I'm sure the seeds of something like Monstera deliciosa or the polka dot plant, which comes from Madagascar and is threatened in its natural habitat, there's probably issues. If I dug into that, I'd find more issues. But I guess this is my mission, really, is just to get to people thinking about not just looking at a grown plant and thinking, oh, well, that's amazing, but thinking about where it actually comes from, whether that's a tiny dust-like orchid seed or a huge, a big lumpy
coconut.
Yeah, exactly. Coco de mer or something. The other aspect that I really loved in this book was talking about another aspect of this sort of undercurrent, which is the seed banks that have been set up around the world. And I had the privilege of going to the Kew Millennium Seed Bank, but there are loads of these all around the globe. And I mean, I sometimes get told off by my children for sort of always talking about apocalyptic things and what would happen in the apocalypse. But this is the whole point of these seed banks, isn't it? It's preparing for a worst case scenario.
Yes and no. Humans have been saving and sharing seed and selecting the best plants from those seeds since we have been walking on 2 feet and engaging with plants as food, as medicine, as ritual, as ornament, all of the above. So humans throughout time have always had seed banks in their own smaller versioned way, where you collect the best of your seeds, you plant most of them, but you save the rest for the next season in case this season's harvest fails. So you are never without them, right? That is just intelligent, common sense thinking based on hundreds of thousands of years of human experimentation and starvation cycles of plenty and then scarcity. So, but in the late 1800s, the very first sort of governmental organized seed bank was kicked off by the Russians in order to collect and store and document as much as they could of their most important food crops and the seed. And they did this because they were in a period of empire building and they wanted to make sure they always had enough seed in order to feed the people and to feed the troops of people who went off to do their empire building. This then sort of morphed in the 1900s from being just this one, the Vavilov Institute, into being series of seed banks around the world in cooperation between governments and large business entities like the Ford Foundation and others, working with governments to protect the food, the human food crop diversity of greatest importance. So it resulted in, through sort of the 1930s through the 1970s, the development of these centers of diversity of seed crops. There was a dryland seed crop seed bank called, it's an acronym, ICARDA, ICARDA in Syria. There's one in Central and South America that is preserving the biodiversity of corns and squashes and sunflowers and plants that are native to this area and of great food importance, human food importance. There's another one in the Philippines for the great diversity of rice. So slowly, more and more of these have been created. The United States has one called the USDA Food and Crop Germplasm Center. I'm getting that a little bit wrong. It's a long title. Based in Fort Collins, Colorado, which is high and dry and cool, which is why it's based there. They are the backup site for other seed bank centers around the U.S. that collect in their area and then send their backups to the USDA in Fort Collins. So Kew, interestingly enough, has really moved from being a traditional seed bank that it started as under the direction of John Dickey into being a seed bank that focuses primarily on the flora of the United Kingdom. Like that is now their special focus, not necessarily food crop plants, which is where they would have started, but the actual biodiversity of native wild plants across the United Kingdom. There are now something like 1,500 of these larger governmental organized seed banks in the world. And together with governments and other corporations and nonprofits, they all got together to create the sort of mothership of them all, the Svalbard Seed Vault up in the Svalbard archipelago north of the Arctic Circle. Norway is the kind of administering country, and their large nonprofit called Norgen helps with the international nonprofit Crop Trust to administer Svalbard. What's interesting about Svalbard is it's very much about the apocalypse. It is the backup copy of all the backup copies. So while the USDA does their own collecting and Q does their own collecting and Acarta does their own collecting and whatever, all of these other ones do their own collecting, Svalbard only serves as a backup copy to these originating collections, so that if there's a war or a natural disaster that impacts one of these seed banks, they have a backup copy in Svalbard to help regenerate not just the plants, but also the seed banks. And so at this point, biodiversity is almost as important a tenant in these seed banks as human food protection is.
It's so important, isn't it? I mean, conflicts happening around the world. I presume that I don't know. Is there a seed bank in Ukraine? And presumably that's being
Yes, it was targeted almost immediately. Like, this is one of the tricks is a terrible word, but one of the strategies in times of war is you try and control and take out your adversary's food supply, because that is what will bring them to their knees. And yes, the Ukraine is a hotspot for grain diversity and growing and supply in our world. And their seed bank of wheat genetics was targeted almost immediately by Russia early in the war. Clearly, I'm sure the same thing is happening in the Middle East. And so that instability should give us all pause as to how we care for our planet and how we care for one another.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's a really this, as you say, it's not a practical how-to. It's not a picture book. This is a read, but a beautiful read, and there's so much here. I mean, I remember reading one of your entries about your daughter going away to college, and I was just looking for it now, but that brought me to tears. It was talking about how, as humans, we are seed within seed, and it's just very beautiful. It's a very, very beautiful book. So I do urge all listeners to go and get a copy. We'll put a link in the show notes to all the relevant info. But it's just been a delight to find out more about this work. And there's so much more we could talk about, but right. I will leave readers to go and explore. And alongside the very difficult issues in here, there's so much hope. Would you agree?
There is. I would. And, I think for me, the great access point was the beauty and the diversity of the plants around us. And that just like enjoying the diversity of oaks and acorns in my area in California, and reconnecting to that mystery and that miracle and that beauty. That right there is, I think, the most powerful access point for us to love and care for these topics and be made larger by them.
And are you sowing some seed this spring?
A lot of seed, Jane. we just did our zinnias, we did our carrots, we did a lot of lettuce. We're looking at our tomatoes and cucumbers and peppers very hopefully as the weather gets a little warmer.
After this interview, I've got to go out to my greenhouse and put some fleece over my tomatoes because it's going to be cold tonight. So, which are, I think they're both self-saved seed. I usually do save tomato seed. That one thing we haven't quite captured. Well, maybe we have, but is just how fun this whole seed
It is
thing
so fun.
is.
Yeah.
It's once you get hooked on it, there's just no going back. So seed stashes, sowing lots of seed, it is the way forward. And I'm sure that you've inspired lots of listeners to think about this in a different way. So thank you very much for joining me, Jennifer.
Thank you, Jane. It's been a pleasure to catch up.
Thanks so much to Jennifer, and do check out the show notes at janeperrone.com for a full transcript and links to the Cultivating Place podcast and Jennifer's books, including What We Sow. That's all for this week's show. I will be back 2 weeks hence, but for now, have a wonderful couple of weeks. I'm going to be heading off to the Malvern show, to the Houseplant Festival all weekend, surrounded by plants and planty people. Cannot wait. Bye! The music you heard in this episode was Roll Jordan Roll by the Joy Drops, The Road We Used to Travel When We Were Kids by Kamiko, and Whistle by Benjamin Banger. All tracks are licensed under Creative Commons. Visit the show notes for details.